The analyst's stylus stopped moving. Not because the data was wrong, because it was perfect, and perfect data in Vethkara's 17 years of naval intelligence work had never once meant what it appeared to mean. She stared at the number, counted again, then set the stylus down with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who suspected the table itself might be a trap. 412. 412 human warships, cataloged, cross-referenced, triangulated by mass signature and drive emission. Every hull accounted for, every weapon array mapped, every captain's name attached to a vessel with the clinical precision of a species that had been charting other civilizations' militaries for 3,000 years. The Dominion Fleet Intelligence Division had never missed a ship. She pulled the stylus back toward her, wrote 4 words at the bottom of the manifest. Where is the rest? The Vethkai Dominion had made contact with humanity 41 months earlier, and in that time had assembled what its senior strategists privately described as the most comprehensive threat assessment ever compiled on a newly discovered species. This was not modesty disguised as confidence. The Dominion had encountered 63 intelligent civilizations. It had absorbed 19 of them, negotiated peaceful subordination from 27, watched 8 collapse under the weight of their own structural failures, and gone to war with 9. It had won all 9. The methodology was always the same. Count everything, understand the numbers, make a single overwhelming offer. The species either accepted the offer or demonstrated briefly why they should have. Humanity had declined the offer 11 weeks ago. The Dominion's response had been measured, patient, and precisely calibrated. 3 fleet groups, a combined 2,040 vessels, ranging from light interdiction craft to the Planet Cracker-class dreadnoughts that had reduced the Shari homeworld's continents to archipelagos in a single afternoon, had moved into position along humanity's outer territorial markers. The message required no translation. The mathematics required no interpreter. You have 412 ships. We have 2,040. They'll negotiate, Admiral Krethsal had told the War Council. They always negotiate when they see the numbers. It's the only logical response. Vethkara had been in that briefing room. She had watched Krethsal speak with the calm authority of a being who had never been wrong about anything that mattered. She had looked at the numbers herself and agreed with him. That had been 19 days ago. The humans had not negotiated. Vethkara's request for a secondary audit landed on the desk of Commander Orathval of the 3rd Survey Division, who read it twice, set it aside, picked it up again, and walked it personally to his superior's office rather than routing it through the standard bureaucratic channel. This was unusual enough that his superior, Director Simhali, looked up from her work with an expression that suggested she was already annoyed before hearing a single word. The analyst from Fleet Intelligence, Orathval said, she's flagging the human census. The census was triple verified. She knows that, she's not saying it's wrong. He set the document down. She's saying the number is too clean. Director Simhali looked at him for a long moment. Too clean. 412 warships, everyone tracked, every signature matched. She's been doing this for 17 years, Director. She says she has never, not once, cataloged an entire fleet with 0 unknowns, not even for civilizations a tenth of humanity's size. Simhali looked at the document. Then she looked at the deployment map on her wall, 2,040 Dominion vessels, arrayed in a formation that had, in 8 previous wars, never failed to produce surrender within 30 days. The fleet moves in 6 days, she said. I know. Tell the analyst her concern is noted. Orathval picked up the document, looked at his director, put it back down on her desk. I'd like that on record, he said, and left without waiting for a response. 3 days before the fleet was scheduled to cross the boundary marker into human space, a Dominion scout vessel, The *ISK Persistent Inquiry *, a light reconnaissance craft operating on standard passive observation protocols, detected something that was not in the manifest. The captain of the Persistent Inquiry was a junior officer named Thesari who had been assigned to border observation duty specifically because border observation was, in the language of Dominion fleet assignments, where careers went to wait. She had been watching human traffic patterns for 4 months, filing reports that no one senior read, developing an involuntary expertise in the rhythm of human freight movement that she hadn't asked for and couldn't use. She knew the pattern. She knew it the way you know a sound in your house, well enough that its absence registers before you can name what's missing. "Pull that back," she told her sensor operator. "The freighter lanes." The display rewound. "There," she said. The freighter lanes were empty. Not reduced, not rerouted. Empty. 117 civilian freight routes that had been in continuous operation for 41 months, carrying food and manufactured goods and raw materials across the inner human systems, had gone dark over the span of 11 days. Not all at once, gradually, one by one, in a pattern that would be invisible unless you had been watching them individually long enough to know each one's normal cadence. Thesari stared at the display for 30 seconds. When did the last one go quiet? Her operator checked, 9 days ago. She did the math. The freighter lanes had begun shutting down 2 days after humanity declined the Dominion's offer, before the fleet had even moved into position. She filed her report at emergency priority and spent the next 40 minutes wondering if she was about to be promoted or quietly reassigned to somewhere worse than border observation. The report reached Vethkara's desk because someone in the routing algorithm, presumably by accident, had flagged it with the same priority tag as her secondary audit request. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something you want to be wrong about. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you read something you already know is right. The freighters hadn't been rerouted. There was no evidence of destination change, no alternative lane activity, no traffic buildup in adjacent corridors that would suggest diversion. The ships had simply stopped. 117 civilian vessels, representing a substantial fraction of humanity's visible commercial fleet, had ceased all detectable movement. She thought about the number 412. She thought about it being too clean. "Where did the freighters go?" she said aloud to no one. Her assistant, a young analyst named Pethvar who had recently transferred from agricultural survey and still wore the expression of someone who wasn't sure if he'd made a mistake, looked up from his console. "Sorry." "Civilian freight," she said. "A civilization at war or preparing for war moves its civilian assets. It evacuates them, it hides them, it repositions them." She pulled up the display. 117 ships disappeared. If they'd been evacuated, we'd see the arrival pattern somewhere. We have continuous observation on every inhabited human system. They would have arrived somewhere. Pethvar looked at the display. He was young enough that the implications landed on his face before he could control his expression. "They didn't arrive anywhere," he said. "No. Then they were modified," Vethkara said, "or stripped, or repurposed." She looked at the display for a long moment. "Or they were never only freighters." Pethvar was quiet. Then, how would you hide a warship's mass signature inside a freighter configuration? "You wouldn't hide it," she said. "You change it, remove the weapons, reclassify the hull designation, fly the routes for 3 years until the pattern becomes data and the data becomes assumption and the assumption becomes invisible." She paused. "Then you stop flying." The room was very quiet. "The fleet crosses the boundary in 3 days, Pethvar said. "I know. Director Semhali already has my audit request on her desk, with Commander Orathval's endorsement." Vethkara stood up. "We're going to go deliver it in person." They did not get to Semhali's office in time for it to matter in the way Vethkara had hoped, because the emergency communique from the border arrived 18 minutes before she did. And Semhali had already been summoned to the War Council when Vethkara reached her door. The communique was brief. The * persistent inquiry, Thesari's ship, had detected an anomalous gravity signature at a point in space that contained, according to every chart and every survey and every 41 months of accumulated observation data, nothing. No asteroid, no debris field, no station, nothing with enough mass to produce the gravity signature that the *inquiry *S instruments had just measured. The signature was consistent with approximately 200,000 tons of dense material, arranged in a compact but irregular formation. A fully armed heavy cruiser mast, on average, between 18 and 22,000 tons. Pethvar did the math standing in the corridor outside Semhali's empty office. His lips moved slightly. Then he stopped moving entirely. "That's not a ship," he said. "No," Vethkara agreed. "That's... yes." He looked at her. "How many?" She didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was, she didn't know. She knew one signature had been detected. She knew the * persistent inquiry had found it only because Thesari had been watching freighter lanes long enough to notice an absence. She knew that the Dominion's border observation net, comprehensive as it was, had not been designed to look for objects that had been engineered to look like nothing. And she knew that whatever they had found it because it wanted to be found. Because if you could hide 200,000 tons of steel in deep space for 41 months without a single accidental detection, you did not make a single accidental detection. You made it on purpose. You made it at a moment of your choosing. 3 days before the Dominion fleet crossed the boundary. "We need to reach the War Council," she said. She didn't reach the War Council. She reached an administrative aide who informed her with practiced courtesy that the council was in closed session. She left her name and her credentials and the single most urgent document she had ever produced in 17 years of intelligence work, and she stood in a corridor of the Dominion's Central Command facility and felt, for the first time in her career, genuinely afraid. Not afraid of the humans, not yet. Afraid of the number, the clean, perfect, untroubling number, 412. She had spent her career understanding that numbers were a language, and like any language, they could be used to say things that weren't true. She had spent her career looking for the lies. She had never encountered a lie this patient, this quiet, this willing to wait for 3 full years inside a truth before it stopped being necessary. Pethvar came to stand beside her. He had printed a physical copy of the gravity signature report and was holding it with both hands, with the careful attention of someone trying not to crumple something important. "The freighters," he said, "the ones that went quiet." "Yes. If they were modified, if they were never only freighters, then the number we've been working with is wrong." "Yes. By how much?" Vethkara took the gravity signature report from him, looked at it, thought about 117 ships, maintained in active commercial operation for 3 years, flying established routes on predictable schedules, generating the kind of observable, documentable, cross-referenceable data that formed the bedrock of an intelligence assessment. She thought about what it would take to plan that, not the logistics, the patience. The institutional commitment to a deception that would produce no result for years. That required every person involved to continue doing their ordinary job, day after day, for years, with no indication that it was working. That required trust, not in a plan, but in each other. "I don't know," she said. "That's what frightens me." The War Council emerged from closed session 2 hours later. Admiral Krethsal issued a statement confirming that the gravity anomaly had been assessed and determined to be. The word he chose was *inconclusive*. The fleet would proceed on schedule. Vethkara received this information via internal message, sitting in her office with Pethvar, who read it over her shoulder and then walked to the window and said nothing for a very long time. "Inconclusive," he finally said. "It means they saw it, and it didn't fit their model, and they decided the model was more reliable than the data." "Can they do that with something that size?" "They just did." Pethvar turned back from the window. He was young, as she'd noted, and the fresh transfer from agricultural survey had left him without certain learned reflexes, including the reflex to accept institutional conclusions without continuing to think. She had come to find this less irritating than she'd initially expected. "What if there's more than one?" he said. She looked at him. One signature was detected because Thessari was watching freighter patterns and noticed the absence. The border net wasn't looking for mass signatures in open space. It was looking for ships with active drive signatures, weapons emissions, approach vectors. He paused. "If you wanted to hide a fleet in open space, you'd turn the drives off. You'd wait. You'd be very, very still." "Yes." "And if one of them was detected because of coincidence?" "It wasn't coincidence," Vethkara said. "I already told you. If they can hide 200,000 tons for 3 years, they don't get detected by accident." Pethvar stared at her. "They showed it to us." "One of them," she said. "They showed us one." He sat down. He did it the way people sit when their legs stop cooperating. "Why?" That was the question Vethkara had been turning over for 2 hours. Why show one? Why, with 3 days until the Dominion fleet crossed the boundary into human space, with every advantage of surprise still intact, with an unknown number of hidden vessels in positions the Dominion had not mapped and could not account for, why voluntarily reveal a single asset? She thought about the number 412. She thought about how clean it was. She thought about what it would take to maintain a 3-year deception, not just the logistics but the belief. The certainty that the plan would hold. The willingness to keep flying freight routes and keeping drive signatures masked and doing the quiet, invisible, daily work of being underestimated for 3 years without any indication of whether it was working. That required something the Dominion's strategic models didn't have a variable for. She wrote 3 words on a document and tagged it personal correspondence to Thessari, the junior officer on the * persistent inquiry who had noticed a freighter lane go quiet. How many more? The Dominion fleet crossed the boundary on schedule, at 400 on the 32nd day, following humanity's rejection of the integration offer. 2,040 vessels, the largest combined force the Dominion had deployed in 400 years. Admiral Krethsal commanded from the flagship Unbroken Certainty *, which was not a subtle name, but was an accurate description of the Dominion's institutional self-assessment at that moment. The humans met them with 412 ships. Vethkara was not on the Unbroken Certainty *. She was in Central Command, watching the engagement telemetry on a display that had been designed for exactly this kind of strategic overview. And for the first 17 minutes of the engagement, she experienced something she had never expected to feel during a battle. The growing, nauseating certainty that she was watching the wrong screen. The human fleet fought. She had to give them that. 412 ships against 2,040, and they fought with a ferocity that the Dominion's tactical models had categorized as probable but strategically irrelevant. The models acknowledged that humans might resist. They simply assessed that resistance at this numerical ratio as mathematically futile. The humans seemed to be operating on different mathematics. They did not fight to win. They fought to cost. Every human vessel that went into an attack run appeared to be calculating not how to destroy its target, but how to make destroying it as expensive as possible. They stripped shields, crippled drives, targeted sensor arrays, not killing blows, but accumulating damage, the kind of damage that required time and resources to repair, and that subtracted combat effectiveness even from vessels that were still technically functional. "They're not trying to win," said one of the tactical analysts beside Vethkara. "No," she said. "Then what are they?" The gravity signatures appeared on the display at minute 23. Not one. Not the single mass reading that the asterisk persistent inquiry had found. The one the War Council had labeled inconclusive. The display registered the signatures simultaneously, all across the engagement zone, in the flanks, in the rear, in positions that had been classified as empty space, as every vessel that had been waiting, still and dark, in the deep black between the boundary and the first human system, turned on its drives. All of them at once. The number on Vethkara's display updated itself. 412 visible vessels, plus 119 emerging from concealed positions. Plus, her throat closed, something in the center of the display. Something large enough that the sensor array initially reported it as a stellar body before the mass reading resolved correctly, and the designation updated to a vessel classification her taxonomy did not contain, had never contained, because the Dominion's intelligence framework had no category for an object of that size that was also, demonstrably, a warship. The asterisk persistent inquiry, asterisk S initial detection, had measured approximately 200,000 tons. That had been a support vessel, a supply ship, one of the escorts. The central object, the thing the escort ships had been surrounding in the dark, for God knew how many months. The object that was now, very slowly, moving massed, according to the sensor array, at approximately 4.7 million tons. The entire engagement zone went quiet in the way that things go quiet, when there is suddenly a different context for every sound that came before. "What is that?" someone said. Vethkara realized she had already known, not the specific shape of it, not the scale, but the principle she had known since the night she wrote "Where is the Rest?" at the bottom of a manifest that was too clean. She had known since she understood that 117 freighters had not arrived anywhere. She had known since she realized that the deception required not just patience but belief. They hadn't been hiding ships, they had been building one. One ship, 3 years, in the dark, while 412 vessels flew their routes and filed their signatures and generated the data that became the assumption that became invisible. While the manifest accumulated, and the Dominion's intelligence division triple-verified a number that was accurate as far as it went, that described every ship they had been meant to see, while the one thing they were never meant to see grew in a cold, lightless pocket of space, riveted together, and welded shut and loaded with every weapon that 117 hollowed-out freighters could yield in 3 years of patient contribution. The humans didn't have a word for it in their public language. The Dominion analysts would spend weeks trying to classify it and fail. Eventually, someone in a debrief that Vethkara attended would simply say, "It's the one they built in secret while we were counting everything else." The asterisk persistent inquiry, asterisk S thesauri, watching from the edge of the engagement zone on a little scout ship that had no business still being in one piece, sent a message that Vethkara received 31 seconds after the central mass signature resolved on the display. More than one, as it turns out, but only one of that size. They had a name for it in their oldest language. I found it in the cultural archive. Best translation, the thing you weren't counting. The Dominion fleet did not break immediately. Krethsal was not a coward and was not professionally capable of processing what his sensors were telling him quickly enough to respond to it as anything other than an anomaly to be overcome. He ordered the formation to maintain engagement with the visible 412 and redirected 60 vessels to intercept the emerging hidden fleet. The 60 vessels performed this task for approximately 9 minutes before the central mass finished its turn, and its weapon arrays came online. Vethkara had read every public document humanity had ever produced about warfare. They were, as a species, remarkably forthcoming with the historical record of their own violence. Their wars were documented in extraordinary detail, fought and re-examined, and studied across centuries. Their military philosophy refined across an unbroken lineage of catastrophe and adaptation that had started on a single continent and expanded in every direction until the entire surface of their homeworld had contributed to the curriculum. She had read it. She had noted certain recurring themes. She had not, in the specific context of Dominion fleet engagement planning, weighted those themes heavily enough. The first was this: humans did not design weapons to defeat enemies. They designed weapons to render the concept of opposition meaningless. The central vessel, the thing you weren't counting, did not engage the Dominion fleet in a conventional exchange of ordnance. What it deployed was not, technically, a weapon in any classification the Dominion recognized. It was a localized disruption field, generated at a scale that required the kind of power plant that could only be maintained by a vessel of that mass. A field that interacted, specifically and catastrophically, with the drive architecture used by every ship in the Dominion fleet. Not because human engineers had reverse-engineered Dominion technology, because they had identified, 3 years ago, during the initial contact phase, a fundamental vulnerability in any drive system that operated at FTL-adjacent frequencies, and had spent 3 years building something specifically designed to exploit it. They had not built a warship. They had built a warship-sized answer to a question Krethsal hadn't known he was asking. 62% of the Dominion fleet lost drive capability in the first 4 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Sitting in space, weapons still functional, crews still alive, going nowhere. Trapped in the engagement zone with 412 human ships that had been fighting for 23 minutes not to win, but to position every surviving Dominion vessel exactly where the field's geometry required them to be. The 412 had not been fighting the battle. They had been setting the table. Vethkara, watching from Central Command, felt something she would spend the next several years trying to accurately describe. It was not fear, exactly. It was not awe, though both were present. It was the specific sensation of understanding, all at once, that you had been reading a document in a language you thought you knew, and discovering that every word you translated correctly had been part of a sentence you had fundamentally misread. She thought about the freighters, the routes, the 3 years. She thought about the people who had flown those routes, day after day, maintaining the pattern, contributing their ships piece by piece to the thing in the dark, trusting that the plan would hold and trusting each other to hold it, without any certainty of outcome and without any way to know if the deception was working. She thought about what you had to believe, as a species, to do that. Not in your technology, not in your numbers, in each other. In the shared willingness to do the invisible, accumulating, thankless work of being underestimated together for as long as it took. She had never encountered an intelligence assessment variable for that. She was not sure one existed. Admiral Krethsal transmitted a request for cessation of hostilities at hour 3 of the engagement. He did not use the word surrender. The Dominion did not have a comfortable word for surrender, not because the concept was unfamiliar, but because it had always been something that happened to other species. The human response came from a voice Vethkara did not recognize. Not a fleet admiral, not a military commander, but a civilian official speaking from what the transmission metadata indicated was an administrative office in a mid-sized human city nowhere near the engagement zone. The voice was calm, not triumphant, not cold. Calm in the way that something is calm when it has been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time and the moment has arrived and there is no longer any reason to be anything other than calm. "We counted your ships too," the voice said. "We've known your fleet composition for 29 months. We know the name of every vessel and the structural weakness of every hull class." A pause. "We've had 3 years to be afraid of you. We used it differently." Krethsal was silent for a moment. The field generator, he said. You built it for our drive architecture. You knew our technology. We knew the frequency, the voice said. You transmitted it to us in your first contact communication as evidence of your capability. You showed us your power. We spent 3 years deciding what to do with what you'd shown us. Another silence. You were never going to negotiate, Krethsal said. It was not a question. We were always going to negotiate, the voice said, just not from where you wanted us to be standing. The ceasefire held. The Dominion fleet, 62% disabled, the remainder surrounded by the combination of 412 visible vessels, 119 emerging from concealment, and the central mass that still had not fully deployed its remaining weapon systems, transmitted formal cessation and waited. Vethkara filed her final report that evening. It ran to 63 pages. The summary was 3 sentences. The number 412 was accurate. It described every ship they intended us to see. The assessment failed not in its methodology but in its assumption that a species counts the same things we count, for the same reasons, with the same definition of what constitutes a warship. She filed it, closed her console, and sat in her office for a long time looking at the wall. Pethvar had gone home. The corridor outside was quiet. The display she'd spent the last 3 days watching was dark. She thought about Thessari, on the persistent inquiry who had noticed an absence in the freight lane data, a silence where there had been movement, because she had been watching long enough to know what ordinary looked like. She thought about the human engineers who had assembled something 4.7 million tons in empty space, in the dark, working in shifts across 3 years with no guarantee the Dominion wouldn't find them before they were finished. She thought about the pilots who had flown the freight routes, day after day, contributing their ships piece by piece, flying empty hulls on established schedules so that the pattern would hold, so the data would accumulate, so the assumption would form and calcify and become invisible. She thought about the civilian official's voice, calm, having waited, having used the fear differently. The Dominion had encountered 63 intelligent civilizations. It had never encountered one that responded to existential threat by first asking, "What will they assume?" and then spending 3 years becoming exactly that assumption, quietly together, in every direction the Dominion was looking, so that the one direction they weren't looking remained perfectly, perpetually dark. The final report of the *ISK persistent inquiry landed in her message queue at 2300. Thessari had attached a single supplementary note below the official text. I asked the human liaison officer why they showed us the one signature 3 days before the fleet crossed. Why not stay hidden completely until the last moment? She thought about it for a while. Then she said, "We wanted Krethsal to have 3 days to stop. We've read your history. We knew he wouldn't. But we needed him to have the chance." I asked her why that mattered, if they knew he wouldn't take it. She said, "Because we're going to have to live with what we built in the dark, and we needed to know it wasn't more than it had to be." Vethkara read the note twice. Then she looked at the darkness outside her office window, at the empty space between stars where things could wait and grow and accumulate unseen, and she understood, really understood, for the first time, why humanity frightened the Dominion's strategic analysts less than it should have, and more than it possibly could have, and why both of those things were true at the same time. They had not won because they were stronger. They had not won because they were smarter, or faster, or better armed. They had won because they had looked at a civilization that outweighed them 5-1, and had asked a question that no other species in 63 contacts had thought to ask. What does it look like when you miss something? And then they had spent 3 years becoming the answer. The Dominion would spend the next decade recalibrating its threat assessment frameworks, redesigning its sensor protocols, rebuilding its contact methodology from first principles. It would argue in councils and committees about what had failed and who was responsible, and what procedures would prevent a recurrence. It would produce documents and reports and strategic reviews of impressive length and rigorous structure. None of them would fully capture it, because the thing that had actually happened was not a tactical failure or an intelligence gap or a methodological error. It was something older and stranger than any of those things. It was the moment a civilization met a species that had been afraid long before it had any reason to be afraid, and had learned across its entire violent, exhausting, catastrophic, unbroken history of surviving things that should have killed it, to do something with fear that most civilizations never thought to try. Not to deny it, not to overcome it, to sit down with it and plan. Somewhere in a cold pocket of space, 4.7 million tons of human labor were beginning to move toward home, built in the dark, named in an old language, running no lights. The biggest ship in the engagement zone,